Good evening. I hate to break up all this wonderful conversation, but we now get started here. So good evening, and thank you for coming out on such a balmy February day. I understand it's about 10 degrees outside. I guess that's an improvement. Sorry to say. My name is Kris Kiesling, and I'm the director, the Elmer L. Anderson Director of Archives and Special Collections here at the University of Minnesota, and I am very pleased to welcome you all here this evening. We're gathered tonight to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the brainchild of Dr. Clark Chambers, the Social Welfare History Archives. And if you haven't said hello to him yet, Dr. Chambers is sitting right here in the front row. We're very happy to have you.
Seeing old friends.
Very good, very good. And making some new ones, I hope. This remarkable and unique collection spans the early 20th century with the records of Survey Associates, Henry Street Settlement, and the National Association of Social Workers to the present day, with the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women and Dr. David Parker's photographic documentation of child labor from around the world. SWHA is one of the most heavily used collections in this building, with hundreds of researchers on site every year and hundreds more assisted by email. I should point out that in its 50-year history, the Social Welfare History Archives has had only 3 curators: Andrea Hinding, David Klassen, and Linnea Anderson, which in itself is quite remarkable. As most of you know, the University Libraries has established the David Klassen Fund for the Social Welfare History Archives to honor Dave's many years of service to the archives and the libraries. But wait, I'm pleased, yes, she did. And I'm pleased to say that as of today, we have exceeded the $3,000 mark in that fund, and we hope that number will continue to increase. And that money will be used to hire students to do scanning and to process collections and to do all kinds of interesting things in the archive. So it's money well spent. And several people in this room have already contributed to that fund, and we thank you very, very much for your support. When you look at the exhibit, and I saw that many of you were in there taking a peek before the program, you'll understand the dedication of dozens of people who worked in the archives over the years, many of whom went on to careers in libraries and archives elsewhere, and some of them even came back. We've had many notes of congratulations from former SWHA alums, and I'd like to read a message from Fran Bluen, who until a couple of years ago was the longtime director of the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. And Fran says, "Just a note to say that because of my teaching schedule here, I am unable to attend the 50th anniversary celebration of the SWHA. I have fond memories of working there in its early days under the watchful eye of Clark Chambers and the even more watchful eye of Andrea Hinding. That experience launched my career in archives, and for this I have been enormously grateful to all involved. Since those early days, it has been a particular pleasure to see how the collections that form the SWHA have informed so much important scholarly work in American social history. It has made an enormous difference. Not too long ago, I had the privilege of having a tour of the splendid quarters that the university has provided for its collections, right in the middle of campus. It is a spectacular structure, so appropriate to the great materials it was designed to hold. Happy birthday, SWHA, and hearty congratulations to all those who had a hand in its growth and development." Nice words from Fran. I want to thank curator Linnea Anderson, designer Darren Terpstra and his student assistant Andrew Nelson for all their work on the exhibit, which is a snapshot of both the history of the Social Welfare History Archives and the last 100 years or so of social work and social welfare. And now I'd like to introduce curator of the Social Welfare History Archives, Linnea Anderson.
Thank you, Kris. Thank you for coming, everyone. This is a wonderful turnout. Archivists love to promote the collections in their care, and tonight is a wonderful opportunity to show off just a small sample of the sources in SWHA as we celebrate 50 years. I hope that this exhibit captures some of the richness and diversity of the holdings in the archives. And I would just like to start by referencing the wonderful foundation provided by Clark Chambers and Andrea Hinding and David Klassen for preserving and sharing the history of social welfare. And as I was researching this exhibit and learning more about their work, it really became an added inspiration for me in my role as the archivist. I have a few quick thanks. In the interest of time, I want to thank some people, but do it efficiently. Darren Terpstra. Darren, where are you? There you are. Our exhibit designer. There is a lot of work and a lot of thought that goes into designing an exhibit, and Darren and I had a couple of meetings, and his design that is in the exhibit tonight actually helped me to coalesce my approach to curating it. It's a challenge to make all of those mid-century documents look interesting, but Darren, you make us look amazing every single time, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Amanda Senst. Amanda, I think you're back there somewhere. She's my student library assistant. Amanda took about 170 boxes out of storage. She photocopied every document that is in this exhibit. And then she took all of those boxes back to storage so that the office would look nice for tonight's event. And that is a huge and essential task. And she also got the job of designing a little mini exhibit that's up on the 3rd floor. So if you do take the tour, make sure you take a look at that. And then Andrew Nelson. Andrew, are you around here somewhere, I think? Andrew is Darren's student design assistant, and I think every time I went into the exhibit workroom, he was measuring or cutting something, and not to mention all those trips back and forth to the large format printer. And then Dave, I would like to thank you as well, not only for letting me pick your brain about the history of the archives over the past few months. I kept sending him emails. When did this happen? Who is that person? Who's in this photograph? But also for setting a great example of how to be an archivist who extends the reach of the archives, encourages a wide community of researchers and students to experience these primary resources, and encourages the use of the collections. You set a great model, and I'm trying to live up to it. So we have 2 short talks tonight to celebrate the 50th anniversary. We have 2 special guests, and thank you very much to both of you for coming. Our first is Liz Richards, who is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. And the coalition records represent an important new direction for the archives in collecting the records of domestic violence-related organizations. Minnesota groups have had an important place in the history of domestic violence advocacy and legislation. And I'm happy to announce that the Minnesota Coalition records are processed and available for researchers to use, so contact me if you're interested in that. I'm excited to see what can be done with them. So Liz, if you wouldn't mind. Come on up.
Hey. So I'm Liz Richards with the Coalition for Battered Women. And the coalition was founded in 1978. We're a statewide organization, has member programs located in all 87 counties. And our programs are those that people are most familiar with: shelters, community advocacy folks, people who do legal work directly with victims of domestic violence. We at the state coalition, we were initially founded really to be a legislative voice, to secure funding for this work throughout the state and to promote legislation. And that still remains a big focus of what we do. We also do public awareness work. We've expanded our policy work beyond just the legislature into legal arenas and government entities like Department of Health. And we also do a lot of what we call capacity building, which is training, resource development. And what we call the current anti-violence against women movement has really been around 35, 40 years. And both across this country and internationally, people look here to Minnesota to really look into what has this work been. And they see Minnesota as really at the forefront of this work. Minnesota had the first shelter in the country, women's advocates in St. Paul. We had one of the very first protective order laws that was passed in 1979, and I would say is probably the most comprehensive and extensive law of its kind in the country. And that there are many other states who are still trying to achieve what we achieved over 30 years ago. We also have the Violence Against Women Act, which is the seminal piece of federal legislation that was pushed through by our own Paul Wellstone in combination with Joe Biden, and I would say, and by Sheila Wellstone, Paul's wife. And it continues to really be a piece of legislation that is impacting this work across the country. And I would say that we have, in more recent years, moved into a global role. Advocates for human rights are known by many folks, working internationally and really taking some of the lessons learned here in Minnesota and going to countries who are just setting up legal systems around anti-violence. And just in the last couple months, a new global organization called Global Rights for Women, which is also sort of a spin-off from Advocates for Human Rights. So that's kind of who we are as a coalition and a movement. But I want to talk a little bit about how we came in partnership with the Andersen Library and what that means for us. 4.5 years ago, our coalition offices needed to downsize and move. And so we were losing 100% of our storage space. And so we were faced with this ever so daunting task of packing up the office, organizing stuff, and thinking about what we were going to do with volumes of materials. And so, excuse me, it was this daunting task that sort of pushed us to look at some broader issues, which was, we knew that domestic violence as a movement was about 35 years old at that time, and that much of the founding work had happened here. And we also knew that a lot of the founders of that work were aging. They were either retiring, moving on, and dying. And like many movements, most of our history was an oral history. It was a storytelling history because we were the people who were there, right? And so it was like, do you remember when? Was how information got passed along. And I would both say, you know, in light of some recent things, you know, we all know about the unreliability of memory. And the other thing is that most of us were not historians by nature. And so my standard is, do I keep something? Can I find it through somebody else? If the answer is yes, I throw it, right? I mean, which is not really a historian view, right? So there's a lot of tossing out of information just out of sheer, like, I don't want to move it again. So that's really why it was really nice to be forced by the office move to really look at this question. And Mary Lou Fellows, who at that point was a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, she was volunteering with us. Also, she's a friend of the library. And she introduced us to each other and brought this together, which has been just marvelous. So also just a few things about the whole process of transferring the documents over. I look back at it, I was thinking about this, and I thought there was all kinds of anxiety with our board of directors and staff people thinking, do we really want to turn over, sign over our materials to somebody else? But I remember having this discussion with the executive director at the time, and I said, let's just go into the back room. And Linnea knows what I'm talking about because she saw our back room. And there are boxes labeled with things like basement, you know, attic, right? Okay. And there were lots of things that weren't even in boxes. And they were just kind of randomly stacked up behind some room dividers. And every now and then it would be like we needed something, and so we would climb over this stuff to get what we needed. So weigh that against having someone taking this material and putting it in a humidity-controlled, heat-controlled, organized, cataloged place. What is it that we are anxious about? So signing it over. But the other thing that caused me anxiety was, because we were packing up to move our offices, and this happened just in the months right before the move, was exactly what do we have to do? And it was wonderful. Linnea Anderson came over. It was amazing. They came in. They kind of looked through the stuff. They showed up with this huge truck. They loaded everything into it. And then here, you know, I show up a few years later, and well, I know that there's a lot of work that went into it. For me, I show up, and we are organized and cataloged, and it looked like we knew what we were doing, right? So it's been really great. So I want to say why I think this is so important to us. and I've seen the outline that's been put together about how the materials are organized, and it's really clear to me that what this process has done is created a framework for this body of information. That clearly, I mean, I know how to get a law passed. I can do community organizing. I haven't a clue what really has historical significance, right? And so what this does is it took boxes and boxes, a semi-truck load of materials, and made it look organized. And it is organized, and it makes sense. And it is in a way that you can come in and sort of figure out, how did things get from where they were in 1978 to where they are today? So that's huge. The other thing I would say is just, it's also given us a way to access the information. And just, I know that over the years before we turned over the materials, periodically, this was the question that always kept coming up from folks. They'd come to me, or I'd get a phone call, and they say, we know, or we heard that there was some time, I think it was in the 80s, that Angela Davis came to town, and she spoke at something at the coalition, right? And I'm trying to prove that, right? And I'd be like, well, I've heard that too, right? And then we'd kind of muck around in some files, and we'd look around and could find nothing. And I know that there's actually some folks who are doing a documentary who are looking for something to prove that fact. And for the life of me, we could never come up with it. And I know that in this process, a poster that advertises Angela Davis speaking at an MCBW conference was unearthed, right, someplace in that morass of paperwork, right? So, you know, just being able to get your hands on information that I think might be in there, right? And we get requests all the time. We get requests from across the country about people asking about legislation, right? How did this happen, right? What did you do? Where, you know, how did you, right? And it's like, let me tell you, memory gets less and less reliable. And so to be able to access that information is really, really important. I also look at things like the policy and funding work happening at the federal level, that there were many people here in Minnesota who helped shape the Violence Against Women Act, who are really critical in that work. And so people come to us looking for information, and now we can actually hopefully give it to them. Also, clearly, researchers, documentary makers, I think, and I just point out, most recently, Michael Paymar and Ellen Pence, a couple years back, did a film with impunity. And at that time, they could not access any of these records, but now those kind of films can really get into some of this material. And the last thing is that this has really given us the ability to look at our own history as a guide for the future. And I think most clearly right now in Minnesota and across the country, there's a real explosion around talking about sex trafficking of minors. A lot of thinking about what should legislation look like? How should we fund this work? What kind of partnership should be established? And I sit in a lot of these discussions, and I think this sounds exactly like the same conversation that was being had 30 years ago, right? And so you don't have to start from scratch. You can learn from, you know, some things, you know, that we learned along the way, right? And so now to actually be able to access that information in a way that is useful is extremely important. And then the last thing I would say is that, you know, I look at the next generation, and I see younger folks coming up, and to be able to say, here is a place where you can go and you can learn about our history. You don't have to start from scratch. We have a really solid foundation, and you can get information about that and build from there. And so those are all the reasons I'm really excited and thrilled about this partnership. And so I just want to publicly say thank you to Mary Lou Fellows for introducing us and pushing us into this. And I want to thank all my predecessors who have done coalition work and who hoarded papers and moved them from location to location over the years. I would not have done as well. And I really want to thank Linnea Anderson and all of her staff who really have put in an enormous amount of work to get this collection available to everybody else, and really thrilled to see where this goes from here. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And our next speaker is Megan Morrissey, who's the Associate Director for the School of Social Work here at the university and Director of the school's Master of Social Work program. And working with students at all levels of their education has been one of my great pleasures as an archivist. So I am really looking forward to continuing the fruitful partnership with the social work faculty. So Megan.
Thank you, Linnea. It's just such an honor for me to be here, and it's a particular pleasure because for my nearly 30 years that I've been here at the university, both as a student and then as a faculty member, my career here has really woven through the archives, and I think I've touched on each of the curators in some way. Andrea Hinding put together the collection from the Downtown Welfare History Archives, which was the first collection that I looked at as a doctoral student in the program. And she did this marvelous introduction that just sucked me right into the collection and actually brought me into the archives for the rest of my career here. It's been great. Clark Chambers, of course, was sort of a giant standing on our campus, and he was on my dissertation committee. And for a doctoral student, especially someone like myself, he was a little bit of an intimidating figure. Dr. Chambers had written the biography of Paul Kellogg, and looking at Paul Kellogg's work in through the Survey and Survey Graphic magazine. And I was writing for my dissertation the biography of Paul Kellogg's wife, Helen Hall. And there was one person who knew much more about Helen Hall than I ever could hope to know, and that was Clark Chambers. So as a doctoral student, I used to go to meet with Clark, and I came out of social work. And I understood things like sampling and dependent variables and internal validity. And I would say to Dr. Chambers, what's my method? What's my method? Because that's how I'll write my paper. And he would say, write as though you are writing to your 100 best friends across the country. And I'd say, that just is not that helpful. Because in the first place, I don't have that many friends. And secondly, you know, I know about sampling. And but what it took me a really long time to learn, and what I think he was really telling me, was that the most difficult part about doing historical research is the thinking. That somehow you have the narrowest window to the past and some small pieces of evidence. And your job is to write a persuasive story, a good story, but a story that is true and accountable to the evidence and the many, many interpretations of the evidence that come in between you and the evidence as you see it. What Clark taught me was that good history demands good writing, and good writing demands good thinking. It was a lesson that took me a long time to learn, but it was a very valuable one. As I became a faculty member here at the School of Social Work, David Klassen was the archivist, and he was here in my first years as a faculty member, and I felt like he was a comrade for me. I teach a class in social work on social welfare history to our master's students, and I also teach a class on historical research methods in social welfare to our doctoral students. So David used to come every year to my master's class. It was very easy when we were over in Minneapolis, and he just had to cross the mall, but became a little harder when they moved over here, but he still came. And he always told the same story, and it's a great story, and I'm glad you told it because I tell it now, and I give you credit. But he would always say that doing historical research and working with primary documents was like dusting your furniture with lemon pledge. That these compiled works of history, it's a great story. These compiled works of history are like years of waxy buildup, but when you spray the lemon pledge, you remove the waxy buildup and you get down to just the documents, and your job becomes the task of telling the story and telling a good story without all the evidence. And then you're pushed right back to good thinking and good writing, because you can't tell those stories without thinking and engaging with those documents very, very carefully. I owe a great debt to David because he put together an assignment for me that I use in my classes, and I think it's a wonderful assignment. David went through many different collections at the archives and pulled out a few key documents from just a range of collections. And so every year I have my students work in groups and I give them a set of these documents. And then I say, there's no Tratner there, there's no waxy buildup, it's just you and the documents. See what the story is that you can find in there. And what's really interesting is that David was very conscious and careful in pulling together stories from persons whose threads don't often get into the tapestry of what we call our collective memory. So from Tratner, we learn about the orphan trains, the movement of children, poor children from New York from 1854 up until about 1929. But thanks to David Klassen, the students in my classes also learn about the Indian Adoption Project, a project from 1957 to 1969, in which Native American children were removed from their families to be adopted by white families in the East. From Tratner, we learn about Jane Addams and Lillian Wald. Thanks to David, my students also learn about someone like Annabelle Lindsay, a prolific African-American scholar and social worker, dean of the Howard University School of Social Work, from a wonderful oral history that Dr. Lindsay did in 1986. And in 1986, Annabelle Lindsay reflects, with the benefit of the civil rights movement, she's lived through it, she reflects on her experiences as a young social worker in the 1920s, when she was unable to stay at the hotels where her white colleagues stayed at conferences. We learn about the ambivalence of a young social worker who is a person of color, who recognizes that loyalty to her profession may mean some distance from her community of identity. And all of the different collections that David has put together really reflect this. I just want to tell one other story about David because I think it also reflects the good story that Clark gave me. In 1997, when the School of Social Work was doing its accreditation, we brought our site visitors over here, and David took us on a wonderful tour of the archives downstairs in the caverns. And as we were there, he said, "Oh, I want to show you my favorite document." And I was like, "Oh my God, this place is huge. What do you mean your favorite document?" And he went over and he pulled out this letter. I keep a copy of this on my bulletin board in my office. It's a letter from John Steinbeck to the campaign manager of Adlai Stevenson's campaign in 1956. But he says a few things here that are just so precious, and this is one of the best things about doing historical research, is that you get to read other people's mail and you come across these gems and you say, I can't possibly keep this to myself. I have to bring this out and share this. Well, Adlai Stevenson writes in 1956, and I wonder if this has any familiar ring to it. at all. It makes me sick to see audiences comparatively unmoved by Stevenson's speeches, and to see and hear the same kind of audiences break into enthusiasm at the bumbling, fuzzy, ill-considered, untrue, and in many cases, meaningless outpourings of Eisenhower. He goes on to say, I think you will agree that speaking is a kind of theater. You must open up an audience's guts to get through to their hearts. In The Grapes of Wrath, when I wanted to pound home a harsh economic fact, I was forced to open my reader by an emotional passage which left him receptive. And I think, again, that speaks to the need to tell a good story, a true story, and one that opens people to the story that you're telling. Finally, Linnea. I can't say enough about what Linnea has done to help my doctoral students over the past several years. My doctoral students come to Linnea and say, I think I'm interested in children. And she knows her collection. She hears what their interest is. She steers them, and she gets them to write fabulous papers. Papers that emerge from stories that are often untold in the larger collections of social welfare. And many of the doctoral students who come out of this class have had their papers published, and it's the first time they have a solo authorship as a doctoral student. It's a great achievement for them. They've presented at national conferences. There's many of them, and I'm not going to name them all. I'm not going to name any of them, actually. But they have had the impact, first of all, of bringing to light some of the stories that we often ignore and helping them to become a part of our collective memory. And that's so important. Secondly, they have promoted the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota, and more broadly, the University of Minnesota as a research university that values the stories in the past from populations that are often underrepresented. And for that, I just am so thankful. I'm so grateful to be here for your 50th, and I'm so looking forward to what's ahead. Thank you.
I know we're slightly over, but we do love to tell stories here. We have a few just brief remarks from Dave Klassen as well. So Dave, come on up.
Well, I have to respond to those two wonderful presentations. Liz, you're talking about the incentive coming from a downsizing and a move. Clark, was there more than 2 or 3 organizations whose records we got that didn't have a similar? I think moving and downsizing are the greatest things that ever happened to archives, is essentially the point there. And Megan, the letter from John Steinbeck to Fred Haler, I found that, stumbled across it my first week on the job. Sue Henderson, sitting back there, remembers I came running to her with that. Found it, and wow, this is a great place. It kept me going for 35 years. I've been looking ever since for something quite as good, but that did the job. SWHA was a great place to hang around, especially if you had 38 years with nothing better to do. It's not that important to others whether or not I had a good time, but I want to tell you why I did anyway, because it relates to what these collections have become. In addition to the Lemon Pledge commercial, I think the other line that I overused rather seriously in making presentations to classes of one sort or another was that Andersen Library was absolutely the nicest recycling center any place on anyone's campus. An intellectual recycling facility, if you want. It was true of Andersen Library. It worked in Walter Library that felt a little bit more like a conventional recycling center from time to time. We were right by the freight elevator there. And the Lauderdale Computer Center before that. But the recycling, what's been so fascinating has been seeing how many different uses could be made of the same document or documents. Repurposing, something written for one purpose being used for a dozen different things, some far removed from what they were created for in the first place. Some of these uses were very personal in nature, somebody trying to trace an ancestor, sometimes looking for the skeleton in the closet and being delighted to say, oh, okay, so that explains why we didn't hear from this guy. He was in prison for a good part of his life, or more often with some really significant policy implications to be taken from the study, whether that was policy for a private sector agency or public policy as established through legislation. Couple reasons why this worked this way. The exhibit, which I think is terrific. I'm curious to see if it works. I'm sure it does, but from someone who knows that stuff was there in the first place, it's just old home week to go back and see it again and all at one time. And I hope that you have the time to really absorb some of this, but it includes a quotation from Clark Chambers. He said once in something he wrote, "The core of social work and history is the same, the study of individual behavior and the course of human experience in society." And so he was saying that in significant part, I think, in trying to make the case to social work educators, schools of social work, why it was important for them to include history in their curriculum. And thank goodness we have people like Megan to do that sort of explaining why it was important to study and understand history, especially the history of their own profession. But it also leads to another reason that those records are so interesting and so valuable. The social workers and the social reformers were so interested in the people that they worked with and the conditions that those people lived in, they wrote everything down. They wrote reports, they wrote case records, they wrote surveys of social conditions. When they went out to visit another city for some reason, they wrote back with description of the interlocking directorate of the kinds of services going on there, so that you have, well, let's see, let me put it this way. The hardest part of doing one's job in the Social Welfare History Archives is to avoid describing every file or every collection as a treasure trove or a rich ore, a rich vein of ore to be mined. Those things sound, those phrases sound great the first time, but they get very tiresome, believe me. But we struggled on in spite of that. I think the biggest sort of recycling and repurposing that went on in a general sort of way, Clark, is this true? When you and others founded the archives, the focus was really on the reformers and the social workers. Who was Paul Kellogg? Who were the leaders in the National Federation of Settlements? What was so special about these settlement workers? So forth. That was the obvious thing to do. Those were the people who created the records, but increasingly over time, we saw the records being used not with them in the foreground or the focal point, but rather the conditions that they were working with. And the clients and consumers and the recipients of the services that were being done, being provided, And it's been really, really, really fascinating to see what can be extracted in that way. So, yeah, we've seen phases. In the early years, a lot of the interest was in the settlement house movement and how they worked in the neighborhood, how they worked in the larger nation and community. We used not to think social welfare archives was particularly sexy, but it turned out to be very sexy when the records of the American Social Health Association and the Association for Voluntary Sterilization and Planned Parenthood and so forth opened another kind of field. We got the records of International Social Service years ago, and well, that's nice. We have a lot of collections. This will be another good one. My goodness, the last 5 to 10 years or something seemed like every third person in the door is interested in international adoption. And what the world knows about international adoption relies in an incredible way to the records of International Social Service and the fact that there is detailed information there that can be made available for use. So something else, battered women will take more of a center stage as those records become available now for the first time. And yeah, there's another 50 years to follow, I'm quite sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Megan and Liz, for your contributions. I want to thank the Friends of the University Libraries for co-hosting this event tonight, and now welcome you out to the atrium to have some hors d'oeuvres and some wine or coffee, whatever you'd like, and to take another look at the exhibit. Thanks again for coming.